Hello, this is Goal Off Grid, where my goal is to live off grid. My friend, who I learned pretty much everything from about farming, was so kind and set aside some birds for me. Muscovy ducks, which I absolutely adore, and some Labreast chickens. She's living in Wicklow though, and well, I am not. Which means if I have her drive all the way down here, I better be set up for all the birds. With the birds waiting for me on what felt like the other side of the country, I had to somehow get some housing for them, so I explored my options. There's a big agriculture store literally 2 houses away from me, and they have multiple stacks of pallet wood just outside of their store. So I got in touch with those guys and I got an agreement on getting all the damaged slash unusable ones that they wouldn't mind giving away. With me not knowing how many of those pallets I would actually be getting, I still needed to prepare some more. Fortunately, there seemed to be a shed on my property, which I haven't had time to explore yet. After cutting away some of the blackberry brambles, I began to dismantle the shed, because well, time had definitely taken its toll on the place. It might have only been a year, but there was enough time for the brambles to overtake the space as well as make some of the support pillars collapse. Thinking back on it, there weren't even that many support pillars. Whoever built that thing must have had even less knowledge than me in proper building etiquette. It was literally held up by these thin metal walls, very long, very bendable. I don't know how they even remotely made this work in the first place. Anyways, since those were blocking all kinds of places, I took them out. The roof sheets were actually the only thing that was properly put together. They had me actually working up a sweat. Everything else was just sort of held in place by spiderwebs and plants. But you know, like with all things that haven't been maintained recently, some things come off easily and some just don't. By the way, the headphone looking things that I'm wearing are actually earmuffs, because banging on metal sheets is surprisingly loud. Cleaning the shed, well, was a journey. One of my viewers referred to it as the biggest IRL loot box he had ever seen, which was quite accurate. There was all kinds of stuff in there. Some tubing for an outdoor water system, a street sign which dated back at least 10 years, a crowbar which I still use to this day and will continue to, an old chimney pipe, an old shelvy type thing probably for plants or something, a beanbag, an old water tap probably for outdoor use, a 35-liter bag of growing earth, something which of my understanding would have either been for putting under a roof or for putting under plants as weed matting, some parts of a bed frame, a broom head, some gutters, as well as a ton of plastic obviously. Overall, quite the haul for a forgotten shed. So there were also a few roof tiles from my house. I didn't mind them at all, but just putting them away took roughly 2 hours I think. Beneath the roof tiles were kitchen plastic sheets. The kinds of stuff you put under your kitchen so you don't walk on cement and you don't have to put in a carpet or use kitchen tiles, you know, that kind. Put it in a shed outside and put huge amounts of stuff on it. It doesn't look quite as appealing anymore. I took them outside to clean up later because there was quite a bit of earth on them, so I put them in the sun to dry out a bit. Continuing to dismantle the giant loot box, I noticed a discrepancy between the depth of the shed and the wall that was right in front of me. There was actually a second area in the shed space that was properly covered from the rain with roof sheets. After dismantling them with a lot of ingenious trickery and using my head a whole lot, what had been uncovered was something that I definitely did not expect to see in a shed outside. More plastic! Just kidding. It was a sofa and an old TV. Sort of stumped by my discovery, not really knowing what to do with it, and the sun slowly going down, I decided to get rid of the last few roof sheets instead and divert my attention to the mess that I had made in disassembling the shed. All the plastic kitchen flooring had to get cleaned up, so I worked at it in my at that point pretty exhausted state. I also protected some of the stuff that I thought would be better off dry instead of getting wet at the next rain shower. And no, I did not care enough about the sofa to create a barrier for that one. Skip forward a week after some iffy weather and me getting distracted by banging at some dry lining inside my house instead of metal sheets outside. The sun finally decided to show itself again. First order of the day was to get the sofa out. If it was anything right now, it was in the way. Did you know that sofas are quite heavy if you try to move them alone instead of with someone else? I'm actually learning that quite a lot of things are pretty heavy if you don't have someone else helping you. A lot of dragging later, I went back to dismantling the shed. Lots more of banging on metal later, I finally got the shed to its knees. Since the sheets were still nailed together, I had to take it apart in my patented way of swinging a hammer at it violently. If you ask yourself as to why I didn't just unscrew the whole thing, the explanation would be that there essentially was more rust than actual screws holding this thing in place, and drill bits did not take kindly to screw tops that fall apart if you apply force to them. After taking that apart and examining the ground where the shed was standing on, I could actually make out a cement platform, which was actually very good news. It meant that not only did I have good protection for my birds from below, I also wouldn't have to use chicken wire on the ground to keep vermin out or mix cement together myself. Though because nature obviously reclaimed this part for itself, I had to clean back the cement patch and cut a few trees and brambles back to make space for the house that I planned to build. Finally being able to make out every corner of the cement, I was presented with a nice 3x3 meter patch of mostly solid foundation. A few cracks here and there on the corners, but overall totally usable. The cement actually had holes for pillars in the corners already, and by digging out some of the earth in the corner you could see loads of wood chip from the old pillars. I figured the next logical step would be to dig back some of the earth where the old pillars sat previously, to make it easier to place the new ones in. Now I have to say, I never put in any pillars before, so the next bit might earn some head shakes of people as I struggled digging and cleaning out this earth. This one hole actually still had a major part of the previous stake in it, and believe me or not, the wood spread roots. It tried its darnest to stay alive. Obviously, I couldn't put the pillar in at all, with that huge piece of wood blocking the way. It had me hunched over for 45 minutes, just trying to scrape bits of earth out, until I finally managed to get it out in one go. Get to the next former pillar position, clear it out of plants, clear the hole, find a bat skeleton, get to the next hole, and repeat, essentially, without the bat skeleton. After roughly clearing them all out, I decided to clean the area a little more and break the broom, as well as take apart some more of the metal sheets on roofing, because I plan to reuse those for the new roof. Enter a new day. I visited the hardware store to pick out some pillars for the house. Here's what I decided to use. One 4.8 meter long square timber piece, which I cut in half to get two 2.4 meter pieces, as well as two 1.8 meter long fencing stakes. For those, I also purchased 4 of these long timber shoes to give them a proper hold in the earth. And to give these pillars a longer life, I also decided to sand them down and then apply some linseed oil. Sanding them down opens up the pores of the wood and allows the wood to absorb the oil even better. I gave them 2 coats each, with allowing a day in between to dry. While those were drying, I still wasn't quite able to easily put the pillar holders in all the way, so I applied the technique of raw force to put them in place. Because I dug out a lot of earth, they were still kind of wobbly, even while having been pushed down 40 centimeters deep into the earth. So I backfilled them as good as I could with earth I previously dug out from all over the place. I tried my best to make the shoes and the pillars completely level, but at some point I went with a good enough approach, because it was next to impossible to find just any of those. Unfortunately, I had to further cut down some trees that were growing right in the place of where the pillars were supposed to stand, so I whipped out my trusty axe and hacked away. After putting all the pillars in place and screwing them to the shoe, you could actually for the first time see a rough outline of how the chicken house would look. At this point, I didn't nearly have enough pallets to build the chicken house, but a friend of mine had cut a deal with a local cooking oil factory who had a lot of sturdy and good pallet wood to give away. So while I was waiting for her timetable to be free enough to come by and drop those down to my place, I used my not so sturdy pallets to build myself a shed. If you want a short video of me building this, feel free to drop a comment and I'll consider it if there's enough interest. Having dropped down over 20 sturdy pallets down to my place, I could once again start working on the chicken house. I keep calling it chicken house, even though it's gonna house chickens, ducks, and maybe even a goat. I need a new name for that. So what I did was inspect each one of the pallets and sort them by how sturdy they were. Obviously, the most sturdy and intact ones would be the foundation. The lighter and maybe not as sturdy ones would go above those, and so on. I picked out my first 11 pallets and put them in the middle of a square. 3 for each side and 2 for the side with the door. The pallets all had the measurements of 1.2 times 1 meter. That way I had a relatively easy time with aligning them and planning on how to build the house. Getting the very first wall of pallets on took a while. It would be the very foundation of how I continued to further shelter this house, so I wanted it to be nearly perfect. I even put something like a masonry line in place to make sure it was in a good angle. For connecting these pallets, I used not so sturdy pallets to take apart and cut a lot of 20 cm long wood pieces. I then screwed those onto the blocks of both pallets to connect them. I also used a mixture of angles I got from the hardware store, which were actually angles for shelves, and some of the previous cut bits to attach the pallets to the pillars. Rinse and repeat, and we got our first wall of pallet wood surrounding us. Of course, I left out the hole for the door. Aligning the second installment of pallet wood was relatively easy as well. There was only a really small difference between the top of the pillar and the pallet wood. That way I had next to no difficulties putting on the pallet wood on top of the other ones. Of course, for this I needed another load of connector pieces, for which I had to take apart another pallet, denail it, cut it up and put screws in them. If you are wondering why I am putting in screws before I'm screwing them onto anything, it's because it is at least 200% easier to sort of pre-drill them and only needing to apply some pressure to the screws with my cordless drill, instead of balancing the screws and the pressure which you use to screw the screw in. I've dropped a lot of screws trying it the usual way, so this is just so much more comfortable if I prepare them in advance. At this point you might have realized that I chose two very different heights for the pillars. One which was 2.4 meter in height and the other fencing stake pillars which were 1.8 meters. This decision was for the simple reason as of me wanting a sloping roof, which in theory wasn't a bad idea but made for more strategic decisions down the road. For example, I had to cut off large parts of the pallets on the side with the 1.8 meters and I had to prepare accordingly for the pallets leading down the slope by putting a line in place for reference, as well as marking the pallet woods for where to cut. Since the roof was sloping, the walls had to slope as well. After putting 4 of the pallets up, I arrived at my very first problem in the assumption that the pallets all had the same measurement. This one pallet had different heights on each of its sides. If I just screwed it on like this, forcing it to be level, it would lack major support on the bottom and would essentially be a very heavy block of wood, being held up by a few screws instead of having a proper foundation where most of the weight lies on. So what I had to do was saw it level, which was actually quite the struggle. Tried the jigsaw, tried the normal saw, tried brute force. I bought a chisel the next day for cases like these. After it was done, I cut it up to match the line I had prepared and put it on. You might notice how I cut like a fifth of the side of this next pallet out. It's because they wouldn't fit otherwise. This side of the house is actually a little too small to fit 3 meters. So I had to improvise. It only helped the stability overall though, because I basically fit it directly around the pillar. Just like on the other side, I put up a line to roughly have an overview of how the pallets should be cut to fit perfectly in line. Then I put another pallet on, tried to make it as straight as possible and put a line on it with a pencil. Take it down, cut it up, put some corner angles on, prepare some more wood for connecting the pallets and give it more stability. And then move on to the next one. Now I don't know if this was the day when me working away at this for several weeks in a row finally caught up to me, or this thing was just especially heavy, but lifting this one pallet felt downright impossible.
The heaviest I've had.
That's what she said. I had to cut off the upper part, which I knew I wouldn't need anyways, to get some of the weight off. Put it on, make it angle, adjust the line, mark the wood, cut it again, put it back on, make it angle, connect it. At the front of my property there were these really long timber pieces, and well, they were part of a fence of some sort. But I don't know if it was just nature having taken over, or the previous owners just trying to make it their mission to stuff these in the hedges so that I have to struggle heavily with getting them out again. Anyways, I got some of them out, which were the ideal length for the place over the door. I pondered a fair bit of what would be the best way to put it on, and after 50 minutes I decided that this would be the most stable way. Afterwards I put in the very only support timber for the roof, and put my first 2 pieces of roof sheeting on. Yes, I know how bad this looks. Don't worry, I changed it a few days later. You might remember the metal sheets that I had lying around in my area. Well, they will be used as fox-proofing materials around the house. You could also say it repels wind and weather just as good. No problem for the first half, but there was a tree and a lot of brambles in the way on the other side. So I went ahead and de-brambled the area just enough for me to squeeze through, while also screwing a giant metal piece onto a chicken house. Following the metal sheets, I decided to put chicken wire all around the upper parts to make double sure that nothing could ever come in here uninvited. May it be crows, squirrels or flying rats. After scrapping my idea of putting in a cement pillar to support my only roof support, I decided to go harvest some more of those ripe, long timber pieces and add them to my repertoire of roof supports. I also repositioned the timber sideways as it provides way more support that way. Putting in 2 more supports allowed for way more stability and more confidence in this house surviving the winter without any problems. After those were in place, it was finally time for some more roof sheeting. Some of them were less than ideal to work with, but no way in hell would I run to my local hardware store and buy new ones for €25 a piece. Even though some were quite bent and made me struggle to connect them either to the timber pieces or the other roof sheets beneath it. But I had my ways to make it work. Bottom side done, I chicken wired the other side as well and moved onto the top side, which left me with a small problem. I was slowly running out of roof sheets to put on. I did have some left over, but most of them were literally unusable in the sense of them having more holes than actual roof sheet parts. So my only real option was to fall back onto my metal sheets, of which I did have a few of them left over. I of course tried to get the biggest 3x1 meter piece straight up to the roof, but my wishful thinking only got me this far. So I cut it in half and started screwing them onto the support timbers and the roof sheets. While it was making a lot more noise and gave me a bit more anxiety, kneeling on the metal sheets instead of the roof sheets, in the end I made it work. After having had a look at the state of the roof, I bought proper flashing tape, to make sure that my roof wouldn't be a single leaking mess after I put everything and the birds in there. Looks finished, right? Almost. I'm getting chickens, 10 of them, plus 1 rooster. And if you didn't know, chickens like to roost. Meaning they like to sit on tree branches or something similar when they sleep. So I scoured through the pile of cut off trees that I accumulated and got to work. I went at it with the principle of trying to not overlap on the same vertical axis. That way they don't poop on each other. Aside from that, I tried to put them all into the spot farthest away from the door, so that I didn't have to duck every time I entered the house. A little bit of pre-drilling and a few screws here and there and it's finished. A place for the chickens to roost. After that I filled the last few gaps, which could potentially be a way for fox or rats to enter the house. Since I was building on the edges of a concrete basis, which had been here for God knows how long, some of the edges started to crumble, so I filled those spots with chicken wire. We are done now, right? Close, but not quite. We still need a door. For that I chose 2 pallets, which were not only sturdy, but also had very little gaps in between the planks. I had to cover a height of roughly 2.20 m, which is not really small, quite the contrary actually for a 1.70 m human like me. So I got to work. I saw that the pallets were a tad bit too wide, so I had to cut them. Measuring, adjusting, back to cutting. Uh-oh, emergency situation. The jigsaw stopped working. It was pretty predictable. This thing had been drawing power from an exposed piece of wire, which was on the verge of snapping any second for a while now. So it was time for some emergency treatment. And yes, I still had the starting soon thing on my screen. Professional streamer, by the way. Anyways, opening up the plug, cutting a bit of the wire off, putting the freshly cut wire back into place, all not a problem. Back to where I left off. I of course tried to leave as little of a gap as possible, to not make it any easier for foxes and the like, which meant a lot of adjusting and shaving off centimeters at a time. I also put in a slightly larger plank at the bottom for similar reasons. After it was finally at a good door-like level of measurement, I put in the hinges and was pretty happy with part 1 of my 2-part door. Part 2 obviously proved to be a little more difficult, so I chose to cut off too little instead of too much. After all cuts had been made, it was time to connect the 2 door pieces. I put them on 2 pallets to try and get a level surface. I also made sure that they were actually level before connecting them, because the last thing I wanted to do was to take them apart again after finding out that they were not. Making sure of that, the next thing I did was connect the inner parts, to essentially make this one large unit instead of 2 separate pallet woods. Afterwards, I put some more wood on the sides to further stabilize the whole thing. And the end result was, well, large and heavy, but it fit. I had to make some more minor adjustments to the door frame and the ground directly below it, but overall it was a pretty good fit. That's cool and all, but we're done now, right? Nope. Time to fill the house with straw. I got a straw bale from my neighbor up the road who has, let's say, a few cows. So fortunately he had a straw bale to spare. Chickens and ducks like it comfy. So to make it comfy for them, I got a whole bale to hopefully last me the full year, and spread a good amount of it on the concrete floor. Time for chickens? Now? Please? I like the birdie thingies and I want to see a lot of them in this video. I'm sorry to disappoint. This is the end of this video. In the next video, however, I will cover how I built my fence and prepared everything else, including food and water, as well as making sure they have a nice little nesting house as well. So yes, chickens and ducks in the next video. Big promise. Here's a little teaser. Thank you for watching the whole video. I know it's been a while, but I've been so stupidly busy with trying to get everything up and ready. And my wrists now have been so kind as to give me the sign that I should let them rest for a bit. Like always, most of this footage has been streamed live on Twitch, and I'd be happy if you could give me a follow and have a look at it when you find the time. If you don't want to miss any upcoming videos, be sure to subscribe and click on the bell.